Welcome back, everybody. Well, I just got back from my second trip in as many weeks. Spent the weekend in Denver with some new friends. Friends that I've known about from the internet, from YouTube for a while now, but got to meet in person, spend some time with. And one of those was Mr. Beat. Great guy. Whenever you know somebody, kind of on screen, like watching their YouTube videos, and granted, I've gotten to know him a little bit more because we did a 4-hour stream together, but you never know what a person's going to be like in person until you meet him. But I can tell you 100% Matt and his wife Shannon are fantastic people. Had just such a great time the last few days in Denver with them. So I thought it might be a fun time to revisit his channel and do another reaction to one of his videos. So I'm going to add these amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Matt's going to propose some amendments that he thinks need to be added to the Constitution, and I'll just offer my reaction to those, whether I agree with them, disagree with them, whether I think they're even possible to pass. Things like that, but I thought it'd be a fun one to do, so I'll put the link in the description to the original content. Definitely check out his channel. 100% encourage you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to his videos. I'm telling you, he knows what he's talking about. He's a smart guy. We had a lot of great conversations this weekend, and I'm just excited to be able to support him once again. So let's dive in to add these amendments to the U.S. Constitution.
This video is sponsored in part by Type-C. I'm Mr. Beat, and I'm in love with the U.S. Constitution. It's like my favorite Constitution ever, seriously. However, it's not perfect because things change, man. Sure, people stay the same, but the technology changes, the culture changes, our knowledge collectively changes. Yep. The Founding Fathers, or dudes who debated and created the U.S. Constitution in the early years of the Republic, knew this. They knew that over the years, the Constitution would have to be amended or changed to reflect a changing country. Thomas Jefferson once even wrote to his buddy James Madison, quote, "Every Constitution then and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years.
Yeah, and Jefferson actually believed that his generation had no right to dictate what future generations should abide by when it comes to a constitution. I think Jefferson probably would have been fine with the Constitution expiring every 20 years or so and the country being forced to come up with a completely new one. I think he'd have been fine with that. But I agree with him with the idea that each generation is going to be different, but I also think it's important that we have the stability of the Constitution. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in the fact that the Founding Fathers made it amendable, but also a lot of wisdom in the fact that it's not easy to amend the Constitution. It should be hard. It should be something that there's so overwhelming a desire to change that it's able to be passed by a large group of people, a significant supermajority of people. That said, I'm wondering ahead of time with some of the stuff that he may or may not propose, because I don't know what he proposes in here, how possible some of these things are going to be given the current divide in our country and given the threshold that is needed in order to pass things.
And those first 10 changes came quickly. Just 3.5 years after the founders ratified the original Constitution, they ratified the first 10 changes, commonly referred to today as the Bill of Rights.
And this Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution it was understood at the time the Constitution was ratified that these were coming. It kind of helped push some of the states that were on the fence about the Constitution, kind of push them into the ratification category by promising to address some of these things.
This was to get those pesky anti-federalists on board with the rest of the Constitution. The states ratified the 11th Amendment 4 years later, the 12th Amendment 9 years after that. However, it took another 61 years to be amended after that.
And this gives you a sense of how divided the country became, especially around the issue of slavery and the issues of states' rights. That it's in the aftermath of the American Civil War that you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which all have to do with the ending of slavery, the granting of citizenship rights, things like that.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, also known as the Reconstruction Amendments, were all passed during a crazy time of reform right after the Civil War. After the 15th Amendment, the 16th Amendment didn't come until 43 years later during another crazy time of reform known as the Progressive Era.
Yep.
The last Progressive Era amendment was the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920.
So think about that. In a span of about 100 years, you only had 3 constitutional amendments passed, and those 3 all had to do with the aftermath of the Civil War. So, yeah, we've got 27 now, I think, 26, 27 amendments. So we've passed a lot in the last 100 years after not passing hardly any for 100 years.
Progressive Era amendment was the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. Since then, in the last 100 years, only 8 additional amendments have been ratified. The states ratified the most recent amendment way back in 1992, and that was for an amendment first proposed way back in 1789. So why is it so freaking difficult to amend the Constitution? Well, we can blame the founders. The founders wanted it to be difficult to amend so that the government was more stable and to lock in their great ideals, you know?
Yeah, and that's true. There's stability in that. There's a stability in knowing that you can't just on the whim of every, think about every time we have an election every 2 years for our 435 members of the House of Representatives. Our senators are for 6 years, and that so that takes a little longer. We're only voting on a third of them every 2 years. But imagine if every time a new Congress was elected, they could just change the Constitution. That would just be a mess, and it would not be stable at all. So I greatly admire the fact that we have that stability.
They also didn't trust the masses much and wanted to make sure it was something that was really important before it altered their beloved document. Hence, it's only been changed 27 times. But there have been some unintended consequences to making the Constitution difficult to change. You see, now we often rely a lot on the Supreme Court to just interpret the Constitution differently to push reform forward.
Excellent point. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but he's absolutely right. I mean, for example, look at the Reconstruction Amendments, which were very specifically passed to deal with things like how the freedmen, the newly freed slaves, were treated by the government, giving them standing, giving them freedom. But the Supreme Court used one of the Reconstruction Amendments as the basis for the ruling in Roe versus Wade back in 1973. So they're using an amendment that had nothing to do with abortion to interpret it to apply to abortion. And I just use that example because that's one that we've just dealt with recently, but there's many of those. Amendments that were passed for one thing that have been interpreted to mean something else. Back in the 1800s, the U.S. Supreme Court actually issued a ruling in which it stated, among a bunch of other things, that it was really a good thing that the New Testament be taught in public schools. And then 100 years later, that same Supreme Court ruled that the New Testament has no place in public schools. Completely opposite opinions depending on the time. And so, the Supreme Court rulings have replaced the amendment process as a way of changing our law without changing the law. Great point he makes.
I don't think most of the founders saw that one coming. But say we are about to enter a time of dramatic reform. Maybe we are, who knows? Well, just in case, here are my top 10 proposed constitutional amendments. Think of it as my amendment wish list. I've been thinking about this for a while, but that doesn't mean this list is any good. It's basically me just having fun. Number 10, the right of citizens of the United States who are 16 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. Yep, you know it. I want to lower the voting age to 16. 16 and 17-year-olds often work and pay federal income taxes. And they're also legally allowed to drive and can be tried as adults if they commit crimes. Plus, there are plenty of 16 and 17-year-olds who know much more about government and politics than those 18 and older. In fact, I'd argue that the 16 and 17-year-olds of today are smarter than at any other time in American history.
let him finish
Let
first.
them have a say. And if you think 16 is too young for the vote, what makes 18 old enough, huh? Number 9.
All right. First of all, I would do the opposite. I would repeal the constitutional amendment that changed it from 21 to 18, and I'd go back to 21. Heck, I'd be willing to go up to 25 to make the voting age. I understand his point in that a lot of 16, 17-year-olds are very educated, and I know those of you who are under 18 who watch this channel are really mad at me right now for saying this. But honestly, I do not think, I mean, you know, our brains aren't even fully developed until we're in our mid-20s anyway. I feel like until you have a certain level of responsibility, until you get out and actually experience the world, until you're not only paying taxes, but you're also doing a lot of the other things that are involved that 16 and 17-year-olds aren't necessarily doing. Honestly, I think this is going to make a lot of enemies from me. I actually would prefer it was harder to vote. I wish that there were more standards in voting. I wish that there were basic citizenship tests you had to pass in order to vote. I feel like there's too many people who are ignorant of basic facts on both sides who vote and who decide the outcome of elections based on promises that are made to them by politicians, promises that can't possibly ever be fulfilled. And again, that happens on both sides. I would make it harder, not easier. That's just me.
9. Congress cannot make any laws that apply to American citizens that don't apply equally to themselves, and vice versa. This seems like common sense, and you're likely surprised right now to hear that it's already not part of the Constitution. Well, it's not. One example of this is that up until 1984, members of Congress didn't have to pay Social Security taxes. The next one is an actual proposed amendment.
Okay, I don't necessarily have a problem with that one. I guess I feel like it's really vague. They can't make a law that doesn't also apply to themselves. Well, a lot of laws get passed that only apply to certain people, right? So I guess I feel like that one's really vague, and I don't exactly know what it means. On the surface, I agree with that they shouldn't be exempt from certain things, like paying into Social Security. But I don't know. I don't know how you would apply that, how you would enforce that.
Almost ratified in the 1970s, known as the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, and I'm just going to read it word for word.
It almost did get ratified.
Number 8, Section 1, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Section 3, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. A big reason why it didn't pass is because folks worried that women would lose special privileges, like not getting drafted to fight in a war. But I say those special privileges be expanded to everyone, dadgummit. Is the ERA really needed when laws and the courts have mostly done a good job fighting for women's rights? I say yes, because just because you don't see discrimination against women now doesn't mean you won't see it in the future. Oh, and one more thing. You do see discrimination against women now. A lot of times it's just more under the radar. And look, more rights for women doesn't mean less rights for men. And here's another actual proposed amendment, nicknamed the Saving Democracy Amendment.
So ERA, again, on the surface, totally agree with the idea. But again, I wonder, how would that be enforced? What would that look like? Yeah, I mean, the immediate effect should obviously be things like women should be as eligible for selective service as men are. But then how do you enforce that when it comes to things like jobs and pay? Like, how do you compare two people if there's only one position in a particular company? I have a lot of questions about how something like that could be enforced. But I mean, I agree with the concept.
That I'm also just going to read word for word here. Number 7, Section 1. The rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons and do not extend to for-profit corporations, limited liability companies, or other private entities established for business purposes or to promote business interests under the laws of any state, the United States, or any foreign state. Section 2. Such corporate and other private entities established under law are subject to regulation by the people through the legislative process so long as such regulations are consistent with the powers of Congress and the states and do not limit the freedom of the press. Section 3. Such corporate and other private entities shall be prohibited from making contributions or expenditures in any election of any candidate for public office or the vote upon any ballot measure submitted to the people. And Section 4. Congress and the states shall have the power to regulate and set limits on all election contributions and expenditures, including a candidate's own spending, and to authorize the establishment of political committees to receive, spend, and publicly disclose the sources of those contributions and expenditures. This is essentially a response to the Citizens United v. FEC Supreme Court decision, which reaffirmed corporate personhood and made it easier for organizations to spend lots and lots of money on political campaigns. Well, as one of my YouTube viewers wrote, quote, "If corporations are people, then they should be able to receive the death penalty. Oh, snap." I agree. Corporations have way too much power over elections in this country.
Don't disagree with any of that. I feel like that's probably pretty reasonable. I think we do have way too much money in politics, and you look at other countries where they don't have that, and I think it's a better situation. I feel like we kind of created some of that mess in the first place with some of the campaign contribution limits and giving people loopholes to get around it. So a lot of this stuff closed the loopholes. I think making things much more transparent are fine. You know, there should be absolute transparency when it comes to who's giving money to elections and how it's working and all that sort of thing. I wish we took a lot of the money out. I would love to see the billions of dollars that get spent on campaigns every year. There's so many better uses for that money, because I feel like people can make up their minds without having to have commercials every 2 minutes from the same candidate over and over and over again. I would love to see the money taken out of politics, so I could support that.
For my sixth favorite proposed amendment, I put it in multiples of sixes. Number 6, term limits for Congress and the Supreme Court. U.S. representatives can't serve more than 12 years, U.S. senators can't serve more than 18 years, and Supreme Court justices can't serve more than 24 years. U.S. representatives also serve 4-year terms, with election years being the non-presidential election years. This opposed to 2 so that they're not constantly running for re-election and could actually focus on, I don't know, legislation. Look, I get that term limits are not perfect, and more term limits actually might cause lobbyists to have even more power and influence in DC. However, I think most of us are just tired of career politicians, and this is the best way to fight that.
Agree with all of that 100%. I even like the idea of changing Congress to a 4-year term, because it does feel like they're always campaigning and that so many of their decisions are based on what's going to get me reelected. I don't know if that would solve the problem or at least make it a little better, but it really does feel like everything they do has to do with what's going to get me 2 more years. So love the idea of term limits. We have term limits on statewide offices here in Ohio. Now, granted, it just causes them to kind of bounce around. So right now, our Governor DeWine used to be, I think, Secretary of State. He was a senator, so they just bounce around from one office to the other, but it's better. I love the idea of term limits. Completely support that amendment.
Number 5, amendments become part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 2/3 of the states or by conventions in 2/3 thereof. So basically, this is just making it easier to amend the Constitution. It'd still be 2/3 of Congress or state conventions to propose amendments, but I want to change it from 3/4 to 2/3 of the state legislatures to be required to ratify them. Currently, that means just 33 states instead of 38. As I explained at the beginning of the video, it's currently really difficult to change the Constitution, which makes no sense as the world is quickly changing.
I disagree with him that it makes no sense to have the Constitution be difficult to change. As I mentioned earlier about the idea of stability, I think it should be really, really hard, and I think it should be overwhelming support for a change to our Constitution. I don't think I support the idea of dropping it to 2/3. I like it right where it's at. Yeah.
Number 4, the Electoral College will no longer pick the president. American
completely.
citizens will directly elect the president.
No.
Now, at the state level, there could be additional reforms, like implementing ranked choice voting, approval voting, or score voting. I'm still for federalism here. Let the states still run their own elections. However, count every vote. One person, one vote. And if you think I'm naive about the importance of the Electoral College, you are sadly mistaken. Check out my video here where I take down the antiquated Electoral College. My top 3 proposed...
All right, completely 100% disagree with that, and honestly, it doesn't even matter what I think of it. It's not changing. I know there's this whole movement right now to do this, I forget what it's called, but it's a system where you get a bunch of states to agree that they're going to give their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote, and everybody says, well, when they just get enough states to reach 270, they'll have it. No, it won't, because it'll get thrown out by the courts, because there's something called the Interstate Compact Clause, which means that states can't enter into an agreement like that without the approval of Congress. Now, could you get the approval of Congress? Yeah, probably. But I feel like the Supreme Court would throw that out in a heartbeat. The Electoral College is going nowhere, and I don't think it should.
Amendments, collectively think of them as a compromise because they do go together quite well, if I don't mind saying so myself, which I just did. Number 3, the 17th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. Yep, get rid of the direct election of U.S. senators and return the power of appointing senators to state legislatures. Now hold up, hear me out. There is little evidence that proves that the 17th Amendment did anything to reduce corruption in both the U.S. Senate and in U.S. Senate elections. Plus, this is an appeal to conservatives who want to revive constitutional federalism and limit the power of the federal government, because guess what comes next?
So yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the direct election of senators was a terrible change that we made. Put it back to the states.
Number 2, the U.S. House of Representatives will have 930 members. Congress may increase the House membership after every U.S. census to account for population growth. Currently, the number is 435, so this would more than double the current size of the House, and of course would also make it so that there would be 1,033 electoral votes, assuming the Electoral College still existed. I know this sounds radical, but you just gotta remember that when the Republic first started, each member of the House only represented 30,000 citizens. Today, each House member represents an average of 747,000 citizens. How can one person truly represent that many freaking people? I mean, we've had the same number of representatives since the 1920s. Since then, the country has grown by 208 million people. Now, if Congress just wanted to pass a law to make this happen, they could. The Constitution does not have to be amended to make this happen. However, I think it is important enough that it needs to be added to the Constitution.
Completely agree. We've been at 435 for a long time, and he's 100% right about the idea that our representation has just grown really, really big. And I feel like, honestly, doubling the size of the government would also solve some of the issues around gerrymandering, which is a constant fight that we deal with. It would make it easier to draw those lines in a bipartisan way, to make it more based on the community. You know, for example, the guy that's about to be my congressman, Bill Johnson, because we've been losing representation in Ohio as the population has shifted. So the district that I'm currently in has been redrawn and eliminated, and but Bill Johnson right now represents a district that runs from about a mile south of my house to about 5 hours away from here. His district from one end to the other is like 5 hours. That's ridiculous. I mean, you can't possibly have the same representation for a place like Canfield, Ohio, as you do for Portsmouth, Ohio. Just different needs, different culture, just different everything and everything in between. So it's ridiculous to have these districts that are drawn like that. So I think that would solve a lot of those problems and give more representation. Love the idea.
Oh, and you might be wondering where I'm getting that 930 number? I just pulled it out of thin air. Just kidding. I got it from an article, this article here by Chris Wilson. It's really good. I've linked it in the description of this video. In the article, Wilson uses math to limit disparity in representation using a basic standard deviation. I kind of know what that means, but the bottom line is 930 ends up being the magic number to make sure that each representative is representing around the same amount of people. One big bonus for increasing the representatives in the House is that it would make gerrymandering more difficult.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying.
Speaking of which, number 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of political beliefs. I know that probably sounds familiar since it's basically the 15th Amendment, but replacing the words race, color, or previous condition of servitude with political beliefs. Since the Supreme Court has already set precedents on racial gerrymandering, but pretty much said, no, we can't do anything about political gerrymandering, I feel this amendment is the best way we can actually fight to make elections more truly representative. So there you have it.
I get what he's saying, and I like the idea, but I don't know how you enforce that either. Like, you would have lawsuits like crazy, no matter what. We're seeing it now. Here in Ohio, they kept drawing the new districts based on the fact that we had to change the number of districts we had, and it kept getting challenged in court, and it kept having to go back to the drawing board. And I know that's happened in other states too. You're always going to have an issue with that one, I'm afraid, because you'll never, I don't know how you come up with a bipartisan solution to that, because somebody's always going to feel it's not bipartisan. So if somebody's got a great answer on how to deal with that and how to address that, I'm all ears. But I feel like, again, that's a really vague amendment that I don't know how you enforce. But I do love the idea of being able to draw those lines better without having to discriminate one way or another against people.
My wish list for 10 amendments to be added to the Constitution. There are others I considered, but I just thought weren't fleshed out well enough yet.
All right, so balanced budget. Love that idea. He hasn't fleshed it out. I don't know about equal opportunity to govern amendment, what that's supposed to mean. Churches may no longer be a tax exempt amendment. Listen, I'm a pastor, so I get the idea of that. Just keep in mind that if churches are no longer tax exempt, that also means that they're able to speak their mind and they're able to have a say in the government. And honestly, I kind of support that, because I feel like a lot of churches are already getting away with that on both sides. Of endorsing political figures in one way or another. So would love to hear that one fleshed out a little more, but I wouldn't be totally opposed to it. All right, so let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Let's keep it civil. I know we're treading onto territory that might lead to arguments. Don't want to see that. You can state your opinion and state it loudly and state it forcefully, but it doesn't give you the right to insult other people, to attack other people. That's not what this is about. So please keep it civil. Use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks, Matt, for a great thought-provoking video to give us some things to talk about. And like I said, definitely check out his channel. Fantastic guy. Could not support him more. So thanks for watching.